Grade 10 Footprints Without Feet, Chapter 1 A Triumph of Surgery. The story, A Triumph of Surgery, is written by James Alfred Witt. He was also known as James Herriot. Being a veterinary surgeon and a British writer, he has jotted down his experiences about different pets and their pet owners. In this story, he writes about a dog named Tricky, and the theme of the story is about the blind love and possessiveness that the owner had for her dog. Mrs. Pumphrey was extremely compassionate and caring. She took good care of Tricky, but as she was very possessive about her dog, she overfed the dog. One fine day, she happens to meet Mr. Herriot on the way, as she was away from home, walking on the street with Tricky. As she went for a walk with Tricky, James Herriot saw Mrs. Pumphrey, and he was really worried about Tricky. Why was he worried about Tricky this time? He stopped his car for a while and he shared a word with Mrs. Pumphrey. He inquired how Tricky had become hugely fat. As Tricky looked like a blotted sausage with a leg at each corner, Mr. Herriot was extremely sure that Tricky was unwell. He observed the dog keenly and he realized that Tricky's eyes were bloodshot and rheumy. He also noticed that Tricky's head had been started straight. And his tongue lolled from his jaws. Being a veterinary doctor, he thought to help Tricky, so he advised Mrs. Pumphrey to take good care of Tricky and stop overfeeding the dog. Mrs. Pumphrey, who was over-possessive about her dog, replied that she did feed the dog with ice cream, cakes, and chocolates, apart from feeding him with malt and Horlicks and several doses of cod liver oil. She thought that it would be fine to feed the dog with chocolates and ice creams. Thinking about this, Mr. Herriot stated and asked Mrs. Pumphrey whether she did cut down on the sweet things as he had advised her to do so. But Mrs. Pumphrey replied that Tricky was quite weak and she had to take good care of Tricky, and this is why she used to feed him with such things like chocolates, ice creams, malt, and cod liver oil. Mr. Herriot was extremely concerned about the dog and he thought to carry Tricky to the surgery and treat him. At that moment, when he met Mrs. Pumphrey, he thought to be quiet. He kept quiet for a while and left from there. After a few days, Mrs. Pumphrey observed that Tricky had stopped eating. Tricky used to lay somewhere in the room, and he was so weak that he could not run around or move even for a while. So Mrs. Pomfrey called Mr. Harriet. Mr. Harriet carried Tricky to the surgery, where he treated Tricky well. At first, Tricky did not mingle with the other dogs at the surgery, but later on, he started eating the meals of other dogs and play around with them. Mr. Harriet thought to inform Mrs. Pomfrey about the condition of Tricky, and this is how Mrs. Pomfrey, who was still worried about Tricky, thought that it would be a good idea to send some eggs, drinks, and other edible items to the surgery so that Tricky can be fed well and be healthy. Mr. Harriet, who was very much concerned about Tricky, did not allow the dog to have such items sent by Mrs. Pomfrey, and so he, along with his partners, used to enjoy the breakfast and hearty meal at the surgery. This continued for some while, but later on, when he could see that Tricky was recovering as he was convalescing, he informed Mrs. Pomfrey about Tricky. Mrs. Pomfrey, along with her chauffeur-driven car, reached surgery and was happy and excited to see Tricky. Her heart was full of gratitude, and she could not find good words how to thank Mr. Harriet. So at the end, we get to know that Mrs. Pomfrey got to know that Tricky was unwell and he needed some good care. In this story, the author is trying to convey how important it is to take good care of the pet creatures, and there is a piece of advice for the pet owners how they should treat their pets in a right manner. Read this humorous story and try to learn what is the message that is conveyed by the author. After reading in between the lines, you will notice or learn that the author, being a veterinary surgeon, is very much concerned about the other living creatures on the planet.